Thank you. And thank you for coming in this sort of terrifying expressionist landscape outside. It was quite the introduction to Canada. Talking about the Open University is quite a sort of odd thing for sort of British people over the age of about 32 because of its extreme familiarity in many respects. The sort of ubiquitous OU logo on the back covers of certain books that would be on courses, the sort of graveyard shift television that you would get right up until the late 1990s, where you would get these quite sort of complex documentaries being shown, again with that sort of logo always in the corner. And going to that exhibition is sort of fascinating, for me at any rate, sort of finding that very, very familiar thing being sort of explained and unpacked in enormous detail with respect to one of its courses. Now, what's interesting for me about, one of the many things that's interesting for me about its output in terms of these brief architectural documentaries is how much they don't resemble these. And these are sort of some bête noirs, really, about the sort of presentation of modern architecture on television in the 1970s, and the particular orthodoxies in the way it was presented at that point. An era in which I think modern architecture is at the absolute nadir of its public reputation. I don't think anybody really, apart from on the sort of fringes of the political right, would now make the sort of arguments that were made across the political spectrum about modern architecture in the 70s. So what we have here is, I don't have one of those pointers of a light, I've got a glow stick, but it's not much use in pointing. So beginning with the earliest, we have here Oscar Newman at the top with the hipster beard. Oscar Newman's main sort of insight into modern architecture being the belief that any space that was not explicitly public or explicitly private would be vandalized, destroyed, and would become a sort of terrifying interzone, sort of Hobbesian landscape of sort of people doing awful things to the buildings and to each other. And here you have Newman outside the Aylesbury estate in South London, and a documentary from 1974 made for BBC's Horizon segment called The Writing on the Wall. And in that documentary, you have sort of two halves. The first half is the extremely familiar story at that point of Pruitt Ego. And that just turns up again and again and again. There's about 3 different versions of it in the exhibition shown by various people. It features also in the documentary below by Robert Hughes. It's seen absolutely everywhere, and is seen to say something fundamental about modern architecture. And one of the kind of many services of the recent Pruitt Ego myth film is it's sort of dismissing this narrative of, Pruitt Ego failed because of architecture, and revealing much more complicated things about class and desegregation and so forth as the actual culprits. Although in a sense that sort of modern architecture being hoisted by its own petard, by sort of saying that it could solve those social problems, its failure to do so became all the more conspicuous. But the kind of key thing in that documentary is Newman sort of first of all talks about St. Louis, and he explains why it is in St. Louis that these sort of open spaces between the blocks lead to vandalism, lead to crime, and so forth. But then after that, he shifts into making the exact same case about the just completed Aylesbury estate. And watching it now, I think, the misanthropy of that documentary and the misanthropy of Newman's argument is really quite breathtaking. There's a particular moment within it where Newman stands in front of a load of children playing and expresses his sadness about, what sort of lives these children are going to have living in such appalling architecture and planning, and how they're all going to grow up to be criminals. I mean, it's outrageous stuff. And of these people, I think, all three sort of come from ostensibly different political places. I think Newman, at the time, was identified, for me, somewhat bizarrely, with the political left. Robert Hughes below with a sort of liberal centre, and Milton Friedman with the incipient neoliberal right. All of them come to remarkably similar conclusions. So below you have, a few years later, Robert Hughes in front of the Tour Picasso in Nanterre, just outside of Paris. And here, the Australian art historian has this sort of episode called Trouble in Utopia, where he explains the failures of modern architecture. And in this particular point, he's standing in front of towers where you can hear quite loudly children playing and sort of see them frolicking about. And as this happens, he sort of declaims in his Australian accent that this place is experienced by everyone who takes part in it, everyone walks through it, as social scar tissue. And, without asking these children whether or not they find their experience of this place to be social scar tissue, it's regarded as total common sense that this is a form of scarring. That this is, something that's really, really inflicted upon people. And then next to it you have Milton Friedman in the 1979 documentary Free to Choose, made for PBS. The particular kind of irony of Milton Friedman launching an attack on all public goods on public broadcasting is worth pointing out. But anyway, their indulgence of him, given that he wanted to destroy them, is deeply peculiar and says, I think, a great deal about the period. So Friedman's kind of argument, partly derived from Newman, is very much one about the public-private problem, and his belief that the reason why the open spaces and the green spaces and the kind of parkland spaces and squares around public housing are in such poor condition is because of the fact that people do not believe them to be theirs. That's why it happens. It's not really to do with maintenance, not to do with budgets. It's a simple psychological thing that people don't clean it because it's not private. And they don't feel it's their property, and they don't feel that they've chosen it, and therefore they don't care what happens to it. So there's sort of three points, really. That for Newman, the problem with modern architecture is that it encourages crime. For Hughes, the problem with it is that it's a kind of misbegotten utopia that derives essentially from avant-garde art that has that should have no application in life. And for Milton Friedman, the problem with it is that it discourages a sort of autonomous consumer choice. Now, what's very interesting in the film you're about to see is that it largely sidesteps all of this. That discourse is sort of there, and you can see it underlying it, but he generally takes a very different approach. So, what he's going to show, and what we're going to show in a moment, is two housing estates in Britain, designed and built in the 1930s, and how they have fared in the 1970s. Both of them share a certain constructional innovation. Both of them share a direct inspiration from the continent, as we like to call it, specifically from France, Germany, and Austria. And that is almost kind of where the similarities end. One of them is an individual building, the other one is a housing estate, one of them is public, one of them is private. Anyway, without further ado, we're going to go into them, but now would be the time to change over. But I've been asked to interrupt it as it goes along. So it will necessarily be sort of bullying and mansplaining. I can't really help it. That's how it's going to come across. Now let me tell you another thing. It would be like, when you sort of watch a film with someone that's seen that film a load of times and wants to point out to you all the best bits. That's what you're going to be doing this evening. So, I'm going to get started. First point. So one of the things you'll notice if you look at the exhibition is there's a breakdown of the demographics of people that subscribe to Open University courses. And the sort of hope, I think, initially from the people that founded it, sort of socialists such as Jenny Lee, who was essentially the kind of brains behind the entire project, regarded it as a form of working class education, something which largely was, the statistics at any rate suggest was a failure. That largely people that were already sort of teachers and lecturers in many cases are the people who were doing Open University courses. I think by the end of the 1970s, about 2.5% of the people subscribing were manual workers, which is still quite a lot of people, but is quite small by the actual amount that there were doing it. And one possible explanation for why people might have felt slightly alienated by it is, you can see right from the bat, Quarry Hill, Leeds, Highpoint One, Highgate. It assumes that the viewer will know that Highgate is an affluent suburb of North London, which most people outside London don't know.
The staple form of speculative working-class housing in Leeds was the row of back-to-backs, right up until the 1930s. These ones are good examples. Scullery houses at 5 shillings a week in groups of 4, with outside privies and ash pits interspersed between each block. Many were in very poor condition. And yet whatever we might think of this type of housing, the communities it provided were intimate, cohesive, and friendly.
Now, that's a sort of something which simply wouldn't have been said in a lot of earlier versions of the sort of modern architecture documentary, particularly the various housing-related films made by things like the GPO film unit and the later Crown film unit, the kind of John Grierson documentary school in the 30s and 40s, thinking here particularly of the film Housing Problems and later film Land of Promise, that both of these featured huge quantities of shots of back-to-back housing and this kind of Victorian speculative working class housing, to say very specific things about it, to say that it was dilapidated, that it was cramped and overcrowded, and that it was full of disease and that it leaked. Whether or not there were cohesive communities in them or not was seen as the height of irrelevance. It would be simply assumed that if you put people into a different building, they would form communities in there. This sort of discourse is something that comes in gradually over the course of the 1960s, to the point where in the 70s it's common sense. But at the time that these buildings would have been, he's going to talk about, were being discussed, this was just utterly irrelevant, something they largely just didn't think about.
Between 1895 and 1900, a 66-acre site down there, the Quarry Hill insanitary area, one of the very worst slums in Europe, was bought by the corporation. In 1935, construction began on the new Quarry Hill estate. The solution was dramatic. Between 1933 to 5, with the socialists briefly in power in the council, the city architect, R.A.H. Livett, designed this huge scheme. The site was ringed by a high, curving wall which protected the communal buildings and low ranges of single-room flats for the old and unmarried.
And I'm not going to talk about what happens to these buildings until right at the end, but a little clue is offered here, one of the things that Tim Benton doesn't talk about. And it occurs to me there's another thing that's not really talked about here, but which it would have been assumed that any viewer at the time, I think at this point much more fairly, would have known, which is the sort of place Leeds is. And Leeds still is a sort of very large, largely working class, although not as much as other cities nearby, industrial metropolis. And like lots of them, quite sort of much more economically differentiated. It was never a single industry town, had textiles and engineering and all sorts of other things happening. But was a quite different place to London. And this is not really explicitly talked about, but I think kind of runs through it. But one thing which I'm sort of slightly amazed he doesn't mention is this motorway. And Alison Ravetz, in her book Model Estate, which I think is one of the single best books written on any British housing estate of the era, mentions how crucial the development of this motorway was for this estate's gradual decline. So on one part, it kind of links very closely, as you'll see in a moment, to the rest of the city centre. But this sort of elevated freeway, as I believe it gets called around these parts, sort of just slices through the area, creating, obviously, huge quantities of noise, a sort of very obvious barrier. And in Ravetz's account, this is when the problems really start, is when this kind of bit of infrastructure is just sliced through it. There's also something that people in Leeds are very proud of. Leeds, in a sort of publicity campaign, proclaimed itself motorway city of the 70s. And if you look hard enough in Leeds, you can still find kind of faded bits, this slogan on sort of faded signs. Motorway city of the 70s.
The plan rode roughshod over the maze of little streets of the old slum area, replacing one complete way of life with another. The flats were built near the factories, the bus station, and the markets and other attractions of the city centre. Here there were great advantages for the working man over a home in one of the outlying suburbs. Within sight of the City Hall, Quarry Hill flats seemed to challenge every conventional idea about working-class housing. From 1933 to 5, a man was paid to carry boards up and down the hedgerow with the slogans Red Peril and Squandermania. And the imagery of the flats was recognizably influenced by dangerous continental and Bolshevik precedents. The inside of the crescent at Quarry Hill reminds us of European modern movement Siedlungen like Bruno Taut's Brits estate in Berlin. At Brits, Taut's balconies looked down into a green communal garden enclosed by a horseshoe ring.
Now that, I think, is that shift, that little shift in shots, I think explains probably better than anything else the difference between how these things were done on the continent and how these things were done in Britain. If you look at those, the green spaces in Quarry Hill, you have these sort of quite grubby lawns, occasionally sort of lone, sad-looking trees. A sense that space is being treated as an afterthought. And then suddenly when you shift to Brits, although he doesn't explicitly mention it, look at it. The green space is far more lush. The stuff people have put on their balconies is in so much better condition. Just that public space in the middle is treated as absolutely crucial, which I think in a scheme like that, it is.
The balconies and corner windows exploited the aesthetic possibilities of this arrangement. Levitt too used these windows, a favourite cliché of the international style. Another source for his imagery was Vienna. Around 1930, the West Yorkshire Society of Architects went to see the socialist estates there. In 1934, Vienna was a cause célèbre, with the Heimwehr militia shelling the socialist housing strongholds. Some of this militant symbolism has rubbed off on Quarry Hill. We can recognize, for instance, a similar use of gigantic parabolic arches. The main entrance arch was lined up with the headrow. Let's look now at the estate in more detail. Construction began from the east end. The first houses were opened in 1938, but the last were only finished in 1940. This is the main entrance arch at the eastern tip of the estate. The first impression is pretty stark. Much of the original decorative detail, particularly around the staircases, has been removed, but the general layout is still very clear. On each side of each staircase, a balcony and a window belong to each flat. Despite the fact that the facades are composed of a range of standardized metal windows, Livett has managed to achieve a sense of individual character for each of the houses. The various blocks of which the estate is composed are organized into large-scale, easily comprehensible forms. But Livett does what he can to make the order of the plan understandable. Here, for instance, he lines up two of his arches along a subsidiary axis. The effect of emerging through these arches and discovering new and surprising vistas provides part of the challenge of designing a large estate. As a whole, Quarry Hill works best on a large scale, as a sequence of vistas and blocks seen in perspective. When it was decided at a fairly late stage in the design to add a seventh and eighth story to the blocks at the west end of the estate, Livett decided to incorporate electric passenger lifts throughout. The staircases, with the lifts at the back, are clearly expressed on the facades, flanked by the balconies. The provision of electric lifts was made possible by the constructional system used at Quarry Hill.
The constructional system is, as they say in Poland, where the dog is buried at Quarry Hill. He talks about it a little bit in the moment. The constructional system, the Mopan system, had been imported from France, and the particular housing estate in France that was the inspiration for it is a very notorious estate, if you excuse my French accent, called La Mouette in Drancy, and which is a sort of prototype in many respects for the sort of standardized post-war housing estate done, about 15 years in advance of that. So essentially sort of point blocks in space, in quite a sort of desolate space, which later became rather notorious for being used as a holding camp for French Jews being sent to Auschwitz. And the system there, even within its sort of first continental application, was found by the 1960s to be in many respects faulty, and the blocks in Drancy were demolished. But there's a history really in Britain of its most high-profile failures in modern architecture being connected to constructional systems imported from continental Europe that weren't entirely understood. The most notorious being the Ronan Point Tower in East London, which used a Danish constructional system which was supposed to go up to 8 stories, which they then stacked up to 22, used newspaper as insulation, and then after a gas explosion, several people were killed when a part of the building collapsed. There's quite a history of this, and in many ways Quarry Hill is the sort of first example of these systems being used and then severely misunderstood.
In the French Mopan system, a light steel skeleton is constructed first. Whole sections of the steelwork, including here one of the lift shafts, were fitted into position. This was quickly erected by Booths of Bolton in 1935, a firm which specialized in industrial steel construction. But there matters rested for 18 months, while the building contractor, Tarrant, tried to adapt the Mopan system to British conditions. Tarrant invented a new method of fixing the precast concrete slabs, employing subsidiary vertical fixing posts with large beveled lugs. Onto these, the precast concrete facing slabs were hung. The concrete slabs were originally faced with white Derbyshire spar and a dark gravel finish, so that an effect of light and dark banding was achieved. An essential feature of such a standardized system of construction was that most of the flats had to be standardized as 2- and 3-bedroom pairs of flats, one on each side of the staircases. The flat plans are rigorously standardized, with the bedrooms facing outwards and the living rooms and balconies facing into the interior of the estate. As much as possible, this side of each flat always faced the sun. The electric lifts are extremely small, just big enough for 2 adults or 1 sack of coal, but quiet and reliable. Many of the tenants have lived here since the flats were constructed, and are very happy.
The interiors are never commented on in this film, which is quite unusual for the time. Robert Hughes makes enormous play in The Shock of the New of the fact that people living in modernist flats do not furnish their flats in a modernist way, something which he considers to be a sign of its failure. When he sort of gets to the Unité d'Habitation in Marseille and finds chandeliers, he has this kind of like, aha, this proves that modernism has failed. Now, Tim Benton doesn't mention it, but I assume he would regard that gotcha as rather silly. That one of the kind of interesting things in modernist flats is that inside you can do more or less what you like with them. So there's no sort of judgment at any point, although the ubiquitous net curtains do suggest something, I think, about, you know, that the architects are very keen to create views, and the net curtains put in are then about kind of shutting those views off.
The living rooms look inwards. The centre of attraction here is the Garshi refuse station and laundry. In the living room, there's a coal fire. On the other side of the wall is the kitchen range, a combined oven and back boiler for the hot water. The balconies were not really intended to sit out on, but as a kind of multi-level backyard with access to a coal hole. They open off the kitchen rather than the living room, and in this way the service emphasis is increased. The kitchens are very small, but well designed, with fitted working surfaces and tiled walls. One of the most extraordinary features of these flats was the sink, with its outlet into the Garshi refuse disposal station. Down this wide outlet, you could put anything from newspapers, bones, bottles, or ashes from the fire. Where it all goes to will be revealed later on. The bathroom, next to the kitchen, was equally compact and inventive. Over the end of the bath, an ingenious hand basin was placed where it could take up least space. The same taps were used for both, but the outflow pipes were separate. Let's look now at what happened to all the rubbish that went down the sink. After being collected in an underground sewer system linking the whole estate, the refuse is drawn out by suction to the Garshi refuse station. The vacuum pump deposits the semi-liquid sludge in 2 large tanks. When full, the solid matter is sucked out along these overhead pipes into hydro-extractors, which spin out the water by centrifugal force. Then the half-dry material is incinerated in the basement. Originally, this machine in the corner, the so-called economizer, used part of the heat from the incineration stage to warm the steam for the laundry on the floor above. Every tenant had the right to use this laundry against a small charge on the rent. The washing machines were added after the war, but originally only these washing troughs were provided. But the hot air drying racks are also original, based on the kind extensively used in Vienna.
This is one of the places where those sort of Bolshevik influences, which you talked about at the start, with, obviously spoken with tongue in cheek, but nonetheless not, that doesn't come from nowhere. These communal services that you get in Quarry Hill are taken very directly, partly from the sort of Austro-Marxist example of Vienna, but also from Soviet example, the communal laundries and sort of collective kitchens that were being built in the late 1920s and early 1930s in cities like Moscow. That these are things that the architects at the time were very much aware of and did consider were applicable to British life. The other thing worth noting in this is the way that the estate has been kind of conceived as a sort of integrated system. That the waste, the generation of heat, the laundries, all of these things have sort of become sort of one coherent ecosystem, something which local authorities from the 1970s onwards spent enormous amounts of money trying to kind of untie and connect to larger sort of grid-like systems, which I think, and again I think in recent years, that sort of integral way of designing those things has become much more fashionable and its virtues seen much more than they were in the 70s.
There was also a well-equipped pressing and ironing room, with a row of tables graded by height for ironing and folding clothes. The original equipment is still there, but hardly used. The windows are arranged in a concertina pattern. Outside, built into the concrete window surrounds, are flower planters. The ironing room dominates the communal heart of the estate. Grouped underneath the laundry is a row of shops which face onto the garden of rest. The original, irregular expanse of grass, nicknamed the village green, was replaced by an officious planning department with these very formal flower beds. The loggia of concrete columns forms an attractive, semi-enclosed space for people to stop and gossip. The garden of rest, however, has become rather bleak, particularly after the removal of the benches. And where the community centre was to have been built, in the middle, there is only a single-storey play school. It's typical of the planning of Quarry Hill that the centre is dominated by functional services, the laundry and the chimney of the Garshi system. Now, in the spring of 1975, they're already preparing to pull Quarry Hill down. And yet, have the lessons been properly learnt? The main faults have resulted from a loss of will on the part of the Leeds Corporation to finish the job properly. All over the estate, communal facilities have been allowed to decay. This play shelter is now used for rubbish. And this space, intended as a playground, has been asphalted over.
This, I think, is one of the most humane things in this documentary, and again something which marks it out very, very sharply from the more kind of popular documentaries being made at the time, is the fact that the estate's very, very obvious decline is ascribed not to its public spaces turning people into criminals, not to people being unable to understand anything that wasn't their personal property, and not to the architects being kind of demiurgic utopians experimenting with people as if they're mere pawns in a sort of cubist chess game, as Robert Hughes would seem to believe. That what's actually seen as the problem is the fact that, quite simply, the local authority has not spent enough money on it. They haven't finished it, the communal spaces, they haven't looked after them, they've removed benches, they've let the buildings fall into decline. That this is, this explanation in many ways strikes me as much closer to what the last kind of few decades of sociology have actually concluded has been the reason for the failure of modernist estates that have, as Quarry Hill eventually did, undoubtedly failed. It's also...
Although over 80% of the site is not...
Missed a bit of my notes, sorry. It's also the crucial difference of the Viennese and Berlin examples, I think, as is already obvious. That if, as kind of Friedman and Hughes and Newman all sort of alleged, this is something entirely integral to the design, that can't explain why it is that the Berlin estate looks as it does compared to the Leeds one.
Built on, very little of it is really usable in any way by the community. Seen in the right light, though, the great ranges do look heroic and rather magnificent. On the other hand, most tenants seem to like the actual flats, adapting and humanizing the balconies, which are like backyards. It's clear that there's a feeling of community in the estate. But it is perhaps symbolic of Livet's insistence on functional amenities that the whole estate is dominated by the tall stack of the Garshi refuse station. This is very different. Highpoint One, Highgate, London, a luxury block of flats designed by Berthold Lubetkin and his partnership Tecton in 1935.
He says a little bit about the difference between the two architects, but I want to kind of take that subtle reference and make it much more sledgehammer. There is a huge difference between the sort of otherwise unknown municipal employee R.A.H. Levitt, worked really only in the north of England, designed a few municipal housing estates, otherwise lost to history, and Bertolt Lubetkin, who is already by the 1970s was regarded as one of the kind of masters of the modern movement, one of the sort of great utopians and great designers who had created sort of one-off artistic masterpieces. And also, Lubetkin didn't need to go to the continent in order to acquire modernist ideas. He was actually from it, specifically from, depending on whether you believe his daughter's biography of him or believe his own account, from either Georgia or Warsaw. Grew up in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and had sort of first-hand experience of working as an architect in the Soviet Union, in Poland, in Germany, and in France. And in France, he had built a block of luxury flats in the centre of the city. So, there's already this difference in the sort of local authority architect and the sort of enormously well-travelled, well-connected émigré who, was the sort of source that people like Levet were then trying to interpret.
From the entrance, you bear left into a single-storey space, referred to as the Winter Garden, which opens off the main ground floor vestibule on the right. The ceiling of the Winter Garden is left rough, with the concrete beams exposed. The big window on the left is composed of glass bricks.
Two things here. One of which, how good the internal spaces look. That clearly there's been no problem with maintenance of this building at all. Secondly, here's Tim Benton, looking quite the hipster, in a way that I think has aged better, perhaps, than Oscar Newman's little beard. But you don't see him in the Leeds documentary. which I find puzzling, and I've not managed to ascertain exactly why this is. He doesn't walk around Quarry Hill telling you about it, so you can't have a sort of shot of him sort of standing in front telling you it's good or bad. But the sort of affluent North London example has him as your specific guide throughout.
The vestibule runs down the spine of the building, with a lift shaft and stairs at each end. The formal detailing of the concrete flower beds and stairs is extremely refined. This is the ground floor plan. You can see how the winter garden provides a roundabout access route to the middle of the building. The staircase and lift shafts are both equally accessible from the vestibule. It is lit by overhead clerestory windows and electric ceiling lights. This is the entrance to what was a tea room for the tenants. It's in the basement, at the south end of the building, but the split-level site gives it a magnificent view over the gardens. The sequence of elegant and spacious vestibules and halls, which we've just been looking at, clearly mark this building out from the working-class council housing of Quarry Hill, Leeds. But Highpoint One is not only much more opulent, as you'd expect from luxurious apartments for well-to-do professional people, but Lubetkin has conceived the building as a work of architecture in the grand manner. Like Le Corbusier's Pavillon Suisse of a couple of years earlier, the building can be considered as a sophisticated marriage between standardized apartment cells up there and individualistic, beautifully sensuous, curving forms in the public areas down here. Lubetkin has exposed the reinforced concrete frame of the building to lift it off the ground. Curving screens of concrete symbolize the rhythm of the landscape and the circulation of people, and serve as a foil to the squareness of the rest of the building. Behind the screen, a miniature ramp linking the tea room with the gardens.
Now just look at those gardens, just the difference in the level of maintenance, in the way that this has been treated seriously as a public space. It hasn't become a sort of afterthought, something that's left off the municipal budget when you start running out of money. This has been treated as an absolutely crucial part of the entire experience of the building.
The curving profile of each balcony, too, links the landscape to the angularity of the blocks of flats. Notice how Lubetkin has exploited different colours and textures, as here on the tea room, to separate supporting from supported. These brick-walled rooms under the body of the building were the bed-sitting rooms for the maids. And this is the outside of the winter garden, which we saw earlier. It brings us back to the front of the building. The central problem of designing any block of flats is a constant one: how to compensate in the communal services and amenities for the necessary standardization and compactness of the individual flats. So far, what we've been looking at can really be described as aesthetic amenities, the richness of form, the beautiful handling of site, which makes this building beautiful to look at. And there's another example behind me here: the subtle way the concrete canopy is curved, shaped to match the curve of the drive. But Lubetkin also handled the functional servicing of his flats in an extremely clever way. And I want to come and show you this now. Look how Lubetkin's used the reinforced concrete structure of his building to tuck the garages away under the bulk of the building. Over here is the tradesman's entrance, and this gives access to a long spinal corridor running the full length of the building.
Now, how much of this is about internal plans and internal organisation? This is something that, again, you will not find in most contemporary discussions. Particularly contemporary televisual discussions. The modern architecture, by that point, has become sort of a matter of aesthetics, or perhaps a matter of semiotics or of sociology. But actual sort of internal planning, why a building is organised in the way it is, almost never features in the sort of BBC and PBS documentaries that I sort of started off with. But here it's considered absolutely important. If you're going to teach a course on modern architecture and explaining things like plans and organisation and services is seen here to be absolutely, sort of unavoidable if you're going to actually understand the building. Which for those of us that have trouble reading plans is a nice thing.
There are two small electric service lifts which provide access for tradesmen and services within the block. At ground floor level, this line of service lifts was kept hermetically sealed from the main circulation system, represented by the main stairs and lifts. All the flats in the block conform to one of two standardized plans. We're going to look at one like this. You can see how ingenious the double circulation system is. Each service lift serves two flats, one on each side, providing service porches which connect with the kitchen and entrance lobby. The flat plans are compact, with a central corridor and small but efficient kitchens and bathrooms. This is the glass door leading to one of the service porches. In the main corridor, a reinforced concrete column occupies little space, but it carries the weight of the structure. The kitchen is on the right, while the bedrooms and bathroom are on the left. The living rooms are spacious and well-proportioned, with a glass...
They're spacious and well-proportioned, but they're also in almost exactly the same sort of naff 70s manner as the ones in Quarry Hill. Which is intriguing, I think, that, that so much of this is rightly, I think, about the contrast between the working class housing estate that's fallen on hard times and the luxury middle class tower that's never faced any particular problems at all. But when you actually get into the interior, everyone seems to be going for a sort of quite similar sort of strange melange of 1970s fashions and Victorian ones. This seems to be absolutely kind of common across class, a sort of cross-class petit bourgeois style. And also, again, that he doesn't consider it worthy of comment. He thinks that you can show the qualities of these spaces regardless of the fact that they've got, wallpaper like that.
Glass door leading onto the end balcony.
No net curtains, though, notice.
One of the main walls has windows running almost its full length. The window opening mechanism we've seen before at Weissenhof.
I mean, I don't need to point out how different the person looking out of the window that you see in each is.
All the bathroom fittings were specially designed for this block of flats. The fittings are kept low and tidied up by the use of white tiling and hidden piping. If this is stark efficiency, it's also most tastefully done. The light switches are neatly fitted to the metal door frames. Thick cork for the hallway, little white tiles for the kitchen. Again, specially fitted cupboards. Notice the enamelled worktop on the left, which pulls out. This is where the refrigerator went, fed with coolant from a central plant in the basement. The fitted cupboards and built-in amenities make these kitchens, like the bathrooms, models for their day. Most of the fittings were standard throughout all the flats. This must be one of the most beautiful views in London.
It's one of the most beautiful views in London because, of course, you can't really see London. The difference here between the panoramas that you see so frequently in Quarry Hill, which are of this sort of very vigorous, quite messy town of sort of Victorian spires and town halls and factory chimneys and motorways, very, very, very urban landscape. And this North London suburbia is fairly vast. And that sort of panorama around there, it could be a small village rather than, somewhere that's about 8 minutes on the tube from Trafalgar Square.
And Lubekin exploited it with this roof terrace, complete with a space to sit out in the sun and a concrete canopy for if it rains. Le Corbusier admired this roof terrace as well he might, since it was based on his own prototypes. And it was Le Corbusier, when he visited Highpoint One in 1935, who coined the phrase, the vertical garden city, to describe the building. Now, the post-war rash of tower blocks, often inconsiderately used for working-class families with small children and inadequately serviced, we perhaps have the right to be sceptical about high-rise building.
This something that becomes later the sort of common sense, I think, after the revaluation of modernism is, yes, it could have worked, but only if it was for the right class of people as individual sort of one-off towers rather than as sort of standardized blocks or as kind of complete housing estates. This is very, very prescient here.
But up here, somehow the logic seems inevitable, and we are seduced.
Right then, I have my slides back. So there are kind of, it's sort of worth reiterating the particular points in this comparison that he's making. One of them is one of scale, the difference between the sort of singular tower designed as a one-off and the kind of complete sort of city within the city of the council estate. There is a question of class, which he doesn't make a huge amount of. He doesn't kind of do these people can't understand this architecture that people make routinely in the 1970s. But he does point out that the different class position of the people in the buildings has a fairly decisive effect on their later fate. Maintenance is something that I think atypically for his time he lays enormous emphasis on, as well as the suburban and urban divide, and of course the question of style. It's fairly clear that he regards the Leeds example as being a little bit sort of stiff and staid and provincial compared with the kind of delicate curves and the sort of high style of Highpoint. So, a slide should have, fantastic. Thank you. So I'm going to sort of try and end the story, so I'm trying to sort of round it off with what happens next with the buildings and with the reputation of the architects. So what you have at the top is a series which was running at the time that the documentary in Quarry Hill was made, called Queenie's Castle, which was a sort of Leeds set soap, basically, which treated the building with a certain amount of warmth. It wasn't a sort of, didn't depict it as a slum, didn't depict the people in it as slum people, had a sort of fairly kind of, sometimes slightly ironic, but generally quite affectionate picture of the building. But below, you have what stands there now. And in the kind of documents that you can flip through in the exhibition, you have an article by Benton around the time that the documentary was shown, saying, well, that the council planned to replace it with high-density housing on a similar plan. This is not what happened. What actually happened is that after the site being derelict for about 10 years, the Department of Health and Social Security, as then was, built an office block there. Actually, it was speculative. Sorry, I'm getting this slightly tied up. It was a speculative office block which was then rented by the DHSS. This is the Thatcher era in there. So if public things happen, they rent from the private sector. So this is Quarry House, designed by the architect Sir Terry Farrell, who's foisted various blocks on this across the UK in the 80s and 90s. And you can see, on the one hand, that it uses a sort of combination of Victorian references, that being the kind of, to use the cliche term used routinely at the time, the vernacular of the city, and combines that in its centrepiece with references to the 30s that are obviously intended as a sort of half sentimental, half jokey reference to the original buildings. The building is nicknamed in Leeds the Kremlin. So if the original buildings were a sort of, a sort of monument to 1920s Bolshevism or Austro-Marxism, these are a sort of strange Thatcherite version of Stalinism. The area behind it, on the other hand, is, I don't need this, do I? Is largely derelict at the time of writing. There's various proposals for doing things to it. So it's sort of fairly hard to see the building's demolition as a particularly positive development. Can I have the next slide, please? In terms of what R.E.H. Levitt did next, he designed a housing estate called Saxton Gardens, also in the centre of Leeds, just slightly, about half a mile away from Quarry Hill, of blocks in space. This time, unlike at Quarry Hill, using the sort of CIAM idea of blocks in space rather than the kind of Red Vienna idea of sort of monumentality and arches and axes and so on. This is a deliberately massively unflattering picture of it by the owners of two of the blocks, the property developers Urban Splash. So Saxton Gardens consisted of 6 blocks, standardized, much like this, somewhat bigger flats than Quarry Hill, but otherwise fairly similar inside. And Leeds City Council sold 2 of them off to a developer who then reclad them and sold them as precisely the sort of thing that it's implied modern architecture should be, i.e. a sort of chic loft living for young professionals, media workers, and so forth. The developers of Saxton Gardens, which was then just shortened to Saxton, specifically market their stuff at the creative class. And their decision was clearly that if you're going to market modernism, that's who you market it towards. If you go there now, however, it's quite surreal because the original buildings are mostly still there. 2 of these blocks have been sort of turned into sort of nouveau modernist chic, and the rest are the original 1950s buildings with lots of sort of dodgy 1980s sort of additions which look incredibly cheap by comparison. So a sort of class divide has started to happen, not just between different kinds of modernist buildings, but within the exact same ones. The building inside is almost exactly the same. The flats haven't been reconfigured. They're about the same size. You know, the open space, more or less the same. It's just the cladding and the ownership have changed. Oh, no. Can I have the next slide, please? So something that's quite notable in the history of modern architecture in Britain is that a building and an architect is much more likely to achieve an enduring reputation if they had the good sense to build almost entirely in London and hardly anywhere else. A lot of important modernist buildings of the 30s in particular in the north of England were completely destroyed in the 1980s. Several buildings quite similar to Quarry Hill were demolished in that decade. But Lubetkin's reputation has gone up and up and up. This is a plate by a company called People Will Always Need Plates, who produce sort of modernist ornaments, sort of modernist kitsch, essentially, is what they do. So rather than having in your flat in Highpoint, you know, some doilies and some neo-Victorian furniture and some really kind of, you know, bad-looking wallpaper, sort of vaguely yellow. Instead, you can have some modernist posters framed, and you can have some plates with the building on, and you can have some tea towels of other Lubetkin buildings on. And the entire kind of reputation of these buildings has completely shifted as a result. These things are marketed purely for their architecture, and a kind of kitsch and sort of emerged around them. And the architects at the best of those buildings have been reconceptualized sort of a long way from the kind of rather demonic or foolish figures they were presented as by someone like Robert Hughes into heroes, essentially. They're now regarded frequently as heroes. And Lubetkin, in particular, is almost as a sort of folk hero status in some circles in London. Can I have the next one? Sorry for the stretching, this is my fault. So Lubetkin's buildings feature in a lot of recent documentaries that try and make a sort of revisionist case for modernism in Britain. One of them is a very interesting recent film called Utopia London, which is mainly about the London County Council and its architects department, but also about Lubetkin and his sort of circle of socialist architects in the 30s, and combines an account of their careers with interviews with residents of their buildings in the present and their overwhelmingly positive impressions of those buildings. Another film which features a lot of Lubetkin buildings is the sort of Saint-Étienne produced film Finistère, which was intended as a tie-in with one of their albums in 2006, I think. And it features, you know, sort of Lubetkin's public housing as well as private housing, such as Highpoint. It features his famous Finsbury Health Centre, a sort of constructivist, free municipal medical centre built around 10 years before the eventual universal healthcare system, the National Health Service, was established and was a sort of precursor to it. And that's not entirely coincidental, as I have it on good authority that Bob Stanley from St. Etienne lives in Highpoint. So Lubetkin's sort of transformation into folk hero goes along with it certain kind of phrases attributed to him. When the Finsbury Health Centre, which you can see just there, was sort of opened in 1938, he was asked by the local press, you know, don't you think that people won't be able to understand, or won't be able, this quite avant-garde building you've built here? And his response was, nothing is too good for ordinary people. And this is now something that's all the time sort of repeated as a sort of way of explaining the appeal of the modern architecture of that era. That these quite experimental sort of continental-derived ideas could be used in everyday life in Britain and could be understood and appreciated. But one of the what's odd about that, I think, is that it's quite a different story to the one that's happening in Saxton and the one that that Tim Benton kind of points to at the end of that documentary, which is that modern architecture is the thing that essentially works best when it's for a sort of minority luxury clientele. That when you've got a small group of people who will all, who can pay for the maintenance, when you've got people who are enthusiasts for architecture, who therefore will move into that building for that building, or will care for it for those reasons. All of this implies a middle-class consumer and implies that that's what modernism can only work as being for. But the kind of cult of Lubetkin and the sort of Lubetkin as folk hero is about something completely different. It's about seeing him and his career as part of the development of the welfare state, as being the part of the development of a sort of a possible socialist Britain that never came quite to pass. It's about a completely different narrative. So this mural was put up recently in between the Finsbury Health Centre and a estate of public housing designed by Lubetkin called Spa Green. And I think looking at this in 2018, this sort of desire that Lubetkin obviously had to build things with the quality and imagination and wit of something like Highpoint for everybody, for the majority, not just for the enthusiasts and the cultists, seems much more admirable to me in 2018 than I think it seemed to anybody in 1975. Thank you.